All right, we might get started. So before we begin, I want to acknowledge and pay my respects to the traditional owners whose unceded lands we're meeting on today. The mountains, rivers, forests and plains that inspire us to do the work that we do here at the IWF. And I recognise the importance of their historical and ongoing knowledge, wisdom and custodianship as we think about water futures for this region and beyond. If you'd like to pop your own acknowledgement in the chat box, please feel free to do so. So hi, I'm Brianna Wyborn. I'm a social scientist at the Institute for Water Futures. If you're not familiar with us, we're a cross-disciplinary group of researchers at the ANU, and our work focuses on identifying solutions to the water challenges of the future. And it's a really exciting time to be considering that and to hear from our excellent panel. The National Water Initiative is going to be renewed and the Water Act is going to be reviewed within this term of Parliament, and the Basin Plan will be revised early in the next term of Parliament. So it's a really exciting and perhaps a daunting time in water policy in Australia. There are many challenges ahead, but there's also a real window of opportunity to address the current problems in the legislative and policy framework. So I'm really excited to hear from our panel today on what sorts of areas need more attention and what kinds of challenges we might face as we move forward. So for our session today, I'd really like you all to encourage you all to use the Q&A function. If you'd like to post questions for our panelists, please feel free to use the chat box to have conversations amongst yourself, respond to the kinds of things people are saying, but we won't be monitoring the comment box for questions to go to the panel. We'd also really like to encourage you to keep the conversation going on Twitter, both through the panel and beyond, using the hashtag #HotWaterPolicy. And if you'd like to follow us on @ANU Water Futures. So before we get started, I'd like to introduce the panel. Today, we've got Professor Mark Howden, who is the director of the ANU Institute for Climate Energy and Disaster Solutions. Mark's our resident climate expert and has been a major contributor to multiple IPCC reports since the early 90s. Dr. Virginia Marshall is the inaugural Indigenous postdoctoral fellow at the ANU with the School of Regulation and Global Governance and the Fenner School of Environment and Society. She's a leading legal scholar on Indigenous water rights in Australia and a practicing lawyer specialising in native title, traditional knowledge, protection and human rights. Professor Jamie Pittock is from the ANU Fenner School of Environment and Society. His research focuses on better governance of linked issues of water management, energy and food supply, responding to climate change while conserving biological diversity. Jamie's well known for his work in the basin, as a member of the Wentworth Group and a scientific advisor to WWF Australia. Dr. Paul Vervol is a research fellow at the Institute for Water Futures and the Crawford School of Public Policy. He works on water economics and policy in Australia and the Asia Pacific, and his current research is focused on risk cost-benefit analysis of water infrastructure projects and the economics of drinking water provisions in remote and regional Australia. And finally, Hannah Feldman's a research fellow with the Institute for Water Futures and the School of Cybernetics. Her research background is in climate communication, and Hannah works on intergenerational environmental issues, centering and championing youth voices in a fast and evolving world of climate, society and technology. So before we begin, some of you may not be familiar with the key pillars of the Labor Party water policy platform that they took to the next election. So I've just got this slide together to show you where we're at. So they've committed to re-establish the National Water Commission, which was abolished under the Abbott government, to broaden the National Water Grid investment policy, to deliver a 5-point plan to safeguard the Murray-Darling Basin, which involves delivering on existing water commitments, increasing compliance, metering and monitoring, restoring transparency, integrity and confidence in the water market, increasing First Nations ownership and involvement in decision-making, and updating the scientific underpinning of the Basin Plan. They've also committed to invest in the restoration of urban rivers and catchments. So this is a big platform to tackle some really challenging issues that we face with water. So I'm now going to turn to our panel to ask them to consider, from their area of research and expertise, which of these is the most significant or perhaps the most challenging aspect of the platform. Mark, I'll hand over to you first.
Thanks, Karina, for throwing in at the deep end on that one. But that's all good. Like, I think from my perspective, this is a worthy sort of set of aspirations and activities if they're actually delivered. there's a few challenges for me sitting in there. And first up is there actually is no vision in that set of activities. The only sort of visionary element is future-proofing our water systems, and also quite rightly acknowledging that First Nations people need to be more included, but also wanting to have increased security for town water. So they're the only sort of, in a sense, vision elements in the plan. And I would have liked to have seen a lot more, what is the future we're heading towards? And that's really important, because rather than future proofing, I think the conceptualization should actually be future embracing. We're heading into a changed world in so many different ways. And so rather than proofing ourselves against that change, we should be embracing that and guiding and directing that change. And so for me, there's it would be lovely to have seen this being an outcomes-based document rather than an inputs-based document. Secondly, I think that apart from a sort of one mention in the problem statement, that there's lots of stuff happening, climate change doesn't appear, and yet it's actually really fundamental to the future of our water systems in Australia. And the scale of that is implicitly underestimated. So, what we've already seen is 85% reductions in inflows into Perth's dams. We've seen a 40% reduction in the flows of the Murray, and largely due to climate changes. And those are just the tip of the iceberg, because the projections for future change are much, much greater. And in fact, when we look at the science, the recent IPCC update, that indicated about a 20% reduction in flows of the Murray systems, or systems around the southeast, per degree Celsius. So our current trajectory of emissions will take us to about 3 degrees Celsius, which commits us to something like a 60% reduction in flows. And the fact that we're already at 40% reduction at 1.1 degrees global temperature change is really concerning. So if anything, the science is consistently underestimating the risk. Secondly, I actually think that those sorts of change, scales of change, if not incorporated into the, the design of these changes and the policies and the institutional arrangements, will break the system. They're of such scale that they can't be accommodated easily within an existing system, which is based on precedent. So setting ourselves up to break a system is not a really good move in the first place. And lastly, I just probably suggest that, I guess one last point there is, because climate change and those scales of change aren't implicitly included, there's an assumption that these systems, both the institutional and the physical systems, can accommodate all users. Yet I think that is really under question. I don't think we can. And the last point, I think, is it's not just a question about updating the science if we're to inform these decisions. I think we have to sit back and actually reflect on the types of science that we're bringing to the problem. And that may be something that Jamie can comment on subsequently, and I'll just leave it there.
Great, thanks, Mark. All right, given that it's just been thrown to you, Jamie, how about you go next?
Sure, I support Mark's concerns. It's great that the policy recognises the need to better understand climate impacts on water, but we know that water inflows are declining into surface waters in southern Australia, and what we don't see in the policy is any sort of direction about how to share the losses across the environment and across different users. I'll defer to Virginia to discuss Indigenous water rights. It's great that it's mentioned, but the $40 million commitment to purchase water entitlements is really, really small, and there's so much more to do in that space. I particularly welcome the high-level policy commitments that the government has announced for the Murray-Darling Basin after that water policy was thoroughly abboted and joiced. The policy commitments are bold, but they will lead to direct conflict with the two recalcitrant states, with New South Wales and Victoria. And the question for the federal government is, how are they going to deal with the two state governments and the irrigation industry. In the past, they have tended to compromise. They need to seriously consider the nuclear option of direct federal intervention to deliver the reforms that the state's committed to but haven't delivered, such as enabling flows of environmental water that fill the river channel and spill out over onto the floodplains to maintain country that Victoria and New South Wales are blocking. I note that 2024 is the date for a reconciliation of Basin Plan implementation. There is zero chance that New South Wales can pass any reconciliation because their appalling governments have simply failed to deliver key projects. And so, for example, the adjustment mechanism, New South Wales will fail to deliver at least half of the water recovery they're supposed to. And so it's really time, I think, for the federal government to muscle up and to find ways of exerting pressure to deliver. I'll defer to Paul on infrastructure, simply to note that the Prime Minister in the past has made some very bold commitments to transparent and decision-making around investments in water infrastructure, in infrastructure more broadly, and if that was applied to water infrastructure, we would have some significantly better outcomes. Let me just finish by talking about two elements that weren't on Karina's slide. There is a disappointing commitment by the government to remove the water restrictions for timber plantation establishment. If done poorly, that could significantly decrease the amount of water flowing into our rivers through increased evapotranspiration. And I do hope the government reconsiders that and other shared risks from changes in catchment management to water supplies. And lastly, the government's largely silent on how they're going to manage water-related disaster risk reduction. So they've talked about a new volunteer program. In the election campaign, there was talk about funding more flood levies. We're way beyond flood levies. It's now time to start doing serious risk reduction through things like restoring floodplains and moving people out of harm's way. Let me leave it at that, Karina. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jamie. Virginia, we might go to you next. Oh, Virginia, you're on mute.
Mundagugu, thank you so much. And I do agree with the points raised by Jamie and Mark. Given my attendance and advocacy for Indigenous peoples at COP26, there are so many issues that are involved here that just are silent. And I think it's underwhelming in the issues that are there, especially as Mark's pointed out with climate change, climate justice, and looking again at the issues, old issues that we very well know that most of this country was settled near rivers. And of course, many Aboriginal people during that time, whether it was those early colonial times or in recent times in the Daly River in Northern Territory, had advised not to build near rivers. We don't seem to be getting the message that Indigenous science, Indigenous knowledge is so important to any of these discussions, but there's rarely enough input or value put on Indigenous-led research. And it's also a very underwhelming area across institutions. So we have to really lift Indigenous research by Indigenous peoples to a level where we are actually sharing in that decision making and also the information. Now, as it's been pointed out, it's worrying as a former co-chair of the National Water Reform Committee and still a committee member, that first of all, that there's no idea how this is going to evolve. We have no information on how that's going to be created. I'm sure it's not going to be through buybacks and other models that we have. And the other issue is that, you know, Aboriginal ownership is considered extremely low. I think it's 0.1%. So it's extremely low. It has been not a priority for any government in the last few years. But also, as been pointed out, the $40 million that has been set aside for Mildren and Enbarn has not been paid. And this is the whole idea that we were waiting on a direction on what is going to happen to that 40 million, which has been pointed out is very, very small change. And there are concerns with the National Water Commission because the National Water Commission had no Indigenous peoples involved. They didn't have Indigenous commissioners, and we would need to see a gender balance there. We would need at least a male and a female representing those issues of men and women's business, and also issues that are precluded for men and women across Australia. So I think that all in all, it's very disappointing that without that involvement, which the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples says in many of its articles, is that we have to have free, prior, informed consent, and that also means putting forward policy, but we also have to be in the decision-making before it's been decided. You know, we have to have those preliminary discussions, and having water separated from the environment and having agriculture excluded from that portfolio is very pleasing. But again, First Peoples of this country have so much to offer and have lived here for tens of thousands of years, but yet again, it's not included in these high priorities. So what we need to look at is the engagement for global peace means water security. And Jamie and both Mark, and I'm sure many of our panellists would agree that this is a very big issue. We must have global peace through security, and security of water, through climate justice, climate change policies, and not just taking on board excerpts of the IPCC reports, but also applying them and making sure that we read them in policy drafting. These are really essential. And again, Indigenous voices in these areas are lacking. And we do have a dedicated minister, Minister Burney, who has a vast experience and understanding of how these areas of politics works. And I would like to see engagement on these issues for First Peoples, because as we know, you know, it's great recognising Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people at the beginning of a session. However, if we're not actually going to do anything physically and practically, these issues will just fall away. But I'm hopeful. And human rights really makes that hope become a reality.
Great. Thanks, Virginia. Hannah, perhaps maybe I'll go to you next to kind of give your take on another group of often underrepresented people. Can you just give us some thoughts about engagement of youth in this water platform?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Karina. So yes, I'm a researcher both in climate communication and how young people are going to inherit really a hotter and more volatile world. We know that this is consistently one of young people's top concerns, not necessarily water just specifically or climate change specifically, but there is a really strong need for care of the environment. And in the election campaign, we saw really different approaches to the youth vote, especially when it came to climate and water issues. And I was actually quite impressed with how Labor were kind of coming to the table on this. I have a small quote here from Labor's young people engagement policy. And it's, quote, "Young people need and deserve a say on the issues that impact them, and government needs the input of young people to develop successful youth policies," end quote. So really emphasising that two-way conversation, but water and environment policies are youth policies, and I think that's where this is kind of falling down. There's a really good framework to engage with young people in the Labor government, an office for youth and so on, but it kind of is still, for all of the conversation about breaking down of silos, which I think is really positive in the water policy, it's really lacking that long-term vision of who is going to inherit this problem. There's a big focus for me on sort of near-term, popular today, Virginia, the near-term focus on, you know, who's engaged at the moment, the compliance, the science, it's still very top down. And I think, you know, I really appreciate all of the previous comments. And one thing that stands out to me, I mean, a few people have touched on really the lackluster vision on First Nations engagement and so on. Some of the language around this is, you know, taking into account First Nations perspective and knowledge. It's still really top down. That's not centering voices. That's, you know, when we get to it, we'll put you in there too. And I think some of that comes through in the youth policy as well. So while I really was quite pleased to see a bit of a focus on interdisciplinary, inter-institutional collaboration in this water policy, what I'm really missing is what that actually looks like in practice and who is going to be set up to really benefit from some of these good policies, and how we're going to set up that handing of the baton over to next generation users of water more broadly, but also, you know, in agriculture in the basin, for people who are inheriting this environment. It's really not there for me. And I think, Mark, right up the top, you mentioned about future embracing instead of future proofing. That has to center next generation, you know, embraces of the environment. And so I'm really interested to see how, you know, for all the talk of this breaking down of silos and the integration of youth engagement with policy, how those two things come together, and hopefully really a recognition of the fact that water and environment policies are youth policies as well.
Great, thank you, Hannah. I'd really encourage people to start popping their questions into the Q&A. We're going to go to audience questions soon, but before we do that, Paul.
Thanks very much, Karina. I'm going to pick up on the expansion of the remit of the National Water Grid Investment Policy. As many people in the audience would know, the National Water Grid Fund, under various guises, has been the vehicle for federal government investment and state government investment into irrigation infrastructure projects of different sizes. That includes the very large dam projects that were announced in the lead up to the federal election, the Urana Dam, Hells Gate Dam up in Queensland, and also the Wyangla and Dungowan Dam projects in New South Wales. Now, in addition to those big, I guess, big name projects, which, as Jamie alluded to, there are some issues in terms of transparency around business cases. There were also a number of other elements of the National Water Grid Fund, or the National Water Grid Authority, which actually could set up the fund and the authority and the various frameworks to be able to adapt or repurpose the remit towards town drinking water supplies for regional and remote communities. So that includes feasibility studies for new projects, although most of those feasibility studies, other than in Queensland, were not made public. And also a science program as well. There's also a range of other, I guess, supporting frameworks around in terms of the proposal by the Productivity Commission for a basic level of service for drinking water supplies in each state and territory, the Closing the Gap community infrastructure targets, and a range of other recommendations. But the challenge right now for an incoming government is, if we want to make some investments in improving drinking water supplies in regional and remote areas, well, it's pretty hard to know where to start. And that's because, despite having a really world-class Australian drinking water guidelines, our monitoring and reporting for drinking water is extremely fragmented. In 2021, the UN Sustainable Development Report said that 100% of people in Australia had universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water. That's not true. And there are many reasons why that figure can be brought forward, but one of them is that our national statistics and our national statistics collection process does not include water systems and town water supplies with less than 10,000 connections. Okay, so that means that around about 8%, or 2 million Australians' drinking water quality and drinking water supply is not incorporated into our national statistics. This is despite the fact that there is a lot of monitoring and reporting that goes on, but it's not publicly reported, particularly in New South Wales, where if I'm in regional New South Wales, I can go into the supermarket, get a can of soup and have a look at the ingredients on the can of soup. But it's very difficult for me to be able to find out what's actually in the drinking water in most places. In addition to that, there's also a lot of places where there is very little monitoring going on. And that includes remote Indigenous communities in Western Australia that are served by the Department of Communities. Now, these are not unknown things. Infrastructure Australia and Productivity Commission have highlighted the need for improved monitoring and reporting. There is an ongoing process in terms of trying to improve our national reporting, but I think we need a very new approach to help inform some of these investments. And the other thing that I would mention in terms of a challenge of expanding the remit of the National Water Grid Fund, one is that, and following up from Virginia's mention of free, prior, informed consent, there has been a mention in the Productivity Commission or a recommendation of a basic level of service be secured in terms of drinking water quality and supply and reliability and affordability, and that state and territory governments, their subsidies in high cost locations should be designed to support that basic level of service. The problem is, though, is that you really need to be, there needs to be a process for remote communities to be able to have a decision-making over what their level of service is and should be. And I expect that it's going to be quite challenging for an authority or for a government agency which has been set up to dispense money for irrigation infrastructure projects to be able to have those types of collaborative discussions. So I think some expertise and some partnerships are will have to be developed. And just one final point in terms of infrastructure investments. In terms of the effectiveness of infrastructure investments, we also have to think about not just drinking water infrastructure, but we have to think about the catchment as well. And we have to think about water resources management. The Murray-Darling Basin Plan has some very, very strong objectives around critical human water needs and around drinking water quality for treatment for human consumption. And my understanding, and particularly looking at the water resource plans and the water quality management plans associated with them in New South Wales, the draft ones, and also the Lachlan, it would appear that managing the risks of poor raw water quality is being outsourced to the local councils and the local water utilities, who do not have as much capacity to affect upstream water extractions and broader decisions. So I'll leave it at that, but thanks very much.
Thanks, Paul. I'm just going to pose a question to the panel about the implications of the renewal of the National Water Commission. No one really sort of picked up on that in their introductory remarks. I mean, we've had a National Water Commission before. Do we need to just resurrect the same one, or does the new National Water Commission need to look different? What do you envisage that its role will be going forward? Go for it, Jamie.
I mean, Virginia touched on a key omission from the first iteration of the National Water Commission, and that was adequate Indigenous participation in its governance structures. That aside, it actually played a really important role the first time around, fulfilling two functions, and one was commissioning genuinely independent and strategic research, which hasn't been the case in the past decade, I would suggest. And the second was reporting directly to the then Council of Australian Governments on implementation of agreements for better water management. And so it really was the independent umpire. And so those functions will be really important again. I would love to see it re-established, but with a focus on plugging the gaps of the last decade, you know, Indigenous water rights, addressing climate change, addressing the kinds of issues that Paul's raised about ensuring that all Australians have access to decent quality drinking water.
Great, thanks, Jamie. Virginia, anybody else want to make any comments on the new Water Commission?
Yeah, well, just as I did say before, is that the National Water Commission without Indigenous commissioners fails. But the process that we were talking about is that Article 18 in UNDRIP says that we have to have input by Indigenous peoples. And First Nations peoples need to be informing government and government policy. And as I know as a practicing lawyer, that many of the drafting of legislation is done without a consensus or an input or a fresh look at these issues with the community. And that is really essential. I think that we've really walked away from meaningful consultation in water and climate change and many of the other issues that we've discussed today. You know, I always have said, you know, if you're sitting in a room where big decisions like these are being made and you can't really see in the room any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people, it's not going to be an appropriate meeting. And this goes for anything that we do. We need to be really conscious that, you know, when I was putting forward an Aboriginal water holder, similar to the Commonwealth Environmental Water Holder, that this would also be a way, similar to the Indigenous Futures Fund was years ago, but Aboriginal people didn't have any control of that at all. So we need to have an Aboriginal water holder, I believe, really to make a difference and being managed by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, because if we don't create some sort of way, such as we do with environmental levies, which create great opportunities for local government, for example, we should also be having levies on water sales, land purchases, a whole range of different issues that weren't, interventions that weren't thought of when water was separate from the land. It's just inconceivable from any Indigenous person's position across the world that you would divide water from the land. That is just nonsense. So we really need to understand that that's something that in our lifetime or in the future, we won't see that coming together. But we've got to deal with the flaws in the policy and in the laws because of this, because of bad advice many years ago, that now we have a whole history of uneconomical buybacks, problems to consider that every source of water has to be written off as only a consideration for monetary gain. So we can't keep on making floodwater, for example, an institution that measures floodplain water through how much we can pay for it or how much we can buy. So we need to really think carefully about Indigenous knowledge and bring ourselves to understanding that connection and identity when we're talking about creating or recreating institutions and why they're not effective today for today's world. And many of us have said that why they're not really fit for purpose.
Yeah, thanks, Virginia. I'm going to pick up on the unbundling of water from land. I mean, that's created other issues for water management. Paul, you mentioned integrated catchment management. I mean, I guess two questions to the panel. Can you imagine a future in which we reverse that decision? And if not, how do we work around some of the kind of perverse outcomes that's created for the ways in which we've fragmented these systems, which we know are actually interconnected? Paul, Jamie, Paul?
Karina, it's a great question. I think it would be very hard to wind back the water market and separation of water entitlements from the land. But I do think that the water markets can be managed much better to reduce the negative impacts. One of the concerns that I have is how catchment land use is changing with climate change and the implications for water availability. So, for example, we saw last year the New South Wales government increasing the surface area of land that a landholder can dam and harvest water from in coastal catchments increased from 10 to 25% of the land without any great assessment. Similarly, with changes in climate policy and the prospect of a great deal of revegetation of pasture lands, a lot of water could be lost to transpiration. These risks to shared water were identified by CSIRO in 2006. The federal government's required to address them under the Federal Water Act, but didn't in the last basin plan. There are ways of managing it. There's some great examples from countries like South Africa that require tree plantation owners, for example, to quantify the water their trees use and to acquire water licenses for them. And so I think there's ways of reforming the water market to bring in, to regulate the inflow reduction activities like farm dams, like tree plantations, so that we maintain the health of the river systems for the environment and for people.
Thanks, Jamie. Does anyone else have anything to add on that?
Maybe I just add, it is given where we are in terms of the way the water market has been set up, that is a challenging idea and would require a lot of reform and change. But a National Water Commission, for example, would be the place to be commissioning that type of work and to be doing that type of thinking. And I think given where we are right now in the MDB in terms of allocated water resources, inequity in terms of Indigenous and non-Indigenous water holdings, and climate change, the risks that Jamie mentioned, some what people might refer to as blue sky thinking, or not even blue sky thinking, but just some practical thinking about how we're going to manage water resources in the basin out to the future, would be very important. And for that to be commissioned by an independent statutory authority would be a really good step forward. Or for the commission itself to be to actually be doing the work and doing the research. I mean, that's one of the things that I know that the incoming or the new water minister, Minister Plibersek, has pointed out when she talked about the need for more technical capacity within government departments to be able to do that type of work. And I think that would be something that would be great.
Great. Thanks, Paul. We're going to go to a question from Paul now. Do you think the Water Act requires amendment to outline more formally how social and cultural factors are considered? A formal dispute resolution process plus a mechanism to assure that science advice is available to the public? Anyone want to take that on? No comments, nobody. Jamie?
One of the really disappointing changes in the past decade and a half has been the chopping and changing of regional natural resource management agencies and catchment management authorities, especially by New South Wales. Where these have been established in states that have retained them, like Victoria, they've been really important platforms for regional communities to come together, develop common visions and prioritise action. It would be great for a new Water Act to give some legislative mandate for these regional bodies and ensure that they meet some sort of common standard in the recalcitrant states like New South Wales. It would also be wonderful, I think, to see the Water Act considering ways of recognising and endorsing Indigenous nations and the concept that some Indigenous nations have put forward of having Indigenous river ranger programs, learning from the Indigenous land and sea management organisations, particularly in Northern and Central Australia, and having the broader community support Indigenous nations in Southern Australia to enable members of those nations to gain employment and to get back onto and manage country. There's no shortage of great work that needs to be done to restore our inland rivers, for instance. And I'd love to see us as a country move in that direction.
Great, thanks, Jamie. We've got another question that's asked the panellists to reflect on the urban river restoration aspects of the water policy. Paul, might throw that one to you.
Thanks, Karina. My understanding was that this was a focus, I think it was $200 million for urban river restoration projects across Australia, I think mainly in cities. There have actually been, where I am in Canberra, there are a number of projects that were conducted under the ACT Healthy Waterways program, which received funding from the federal government. There are a number of wetland projects. This is carried on into a second phase as well. Urban wetlands for water quality improvements, and also to supply water to playing fields and various other benefits. What I would say is that this is a great example of the type where you could have some pilot projects and some policy experiments in different locations, and then be able to learn what some of the benefits might be, and measure some of the benefits over time in terms of climate change adaptation, biodiversity, and also in terms of recreational amenity. Now, I'm an economist, and we can try and start to measure some of these benefits, because one of the big challenges with these types of projects is that a lot of the benefits are so-called public benefits, which can be quite hard for a government to be able to recoup. So if we can start to understand a little bit more how some of these benefits manifest themselves, and think about some of the ways that we could finance some of these projects in a creative way, that would be a really good step forward. So I would hope to see some of that 200 million really to be focused on experiments, an experimental approach.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Does anybody else have anything to add on the urban water? Mark?
Oh, look, I agree with Paul, but just to add that those urban water restoration activities tend to be really, really great for engaging the public. So you get a lot of public support if they're well done, and it's really builds up environmental understanding, and particularly with young people. I've actually been to a couple of sort of walks down our urban restored urban waterways in Canberra, and predominantly the people on those walks are young, and so they're just teenagers who are quite intrigued by this happening in their backyard, and the sort of co-benefits that can arise from that. So I actually think there's as Paul was saying, there's lots of both tangible and intangible benefits, and we need to take into account all of those.
Great, thanks, Mark. We've got another question here. Does the panel consider that the Basin Plan can be delivered on time and in full by 2024? And if not, what do they consider the path forward being for basin governments? Jamie, I know you've got lots to say about this one.
Well, I think the answer is absolutely not. The first thing to say is the Basin Plan is actually a plan plus a series of parallel government programs to deliver synergistic benefits, like the commitment made by the Commonwealth to South Australia to increase environmental water by 450 billion litres a year. It's not formally in the Basin Plan. But if you look at the range of commitments that were adopted in 2012, the answer is no. So some of the most crucial elements of reform now physically can't be delivered in time, like reaching agreement with riverside farmers to enable environmental flows to fill up river channels and spill out onto the floodplain to sustain that country. I think that as a society, we should try and achieve as much as we intended to by 2024. I'd love to see the current federal government put the thumb screws to the Victorian and New South Wales governments to get them to deliver the things that they've lagged on. but we're going to have a very difficult reconciliation in 2024 when we have to decide what to do about the targets that were missed. Do we extend deadlines? Do we revisit some of the targets? It's going to be very, very tricky. But I think the moral of the story is that the Water Act and the Basin Plan haven't been managed in a way that provides sufficient incentives for state government compliance and indeed penalties if they don't deliver.
Anybody else want to add anything onto that one? No. I just want to pick up on climate change has been mentioned a few times as something that's a critical issue and perhaps something that hasn't been dealt with adequately. Just invite the panel to make some comments on what they think it might look like to take climate change seriously in these reforms. What needs to be done? Where would you start? Mark, Virginia, go for it.
Yeah, look, I think the most important thing, and we've really talked about this in this venue, is that it's really important to engage with people that are really living with these issues that are really extending through any action in policy for climate change and climate justice. So it really is a whole of Australia consultation, and we've really not had the experience of groups that really don't have loud voices and are not represented by NGOs and don't have an international audience. So there's many instances that we've had that remote and rural communities, especially in Indigenous communities, have been having to use energy cards and do not have subsidies for and sufficient subsidies for solar and any other creations of support that gives rural and remote Indigenous people the opportunity to be off the grid, for example. You know, these energy cards that are also part and parcel of the cashless debit card are just really creating poverty. And when you've been in those extreme heats in rural and remote areas that are over 40 to 50 degrees, and you know, many elders having to live in a really poorly ventilated and poorly air-conditioned or without air conditioning, it means that there is suffering. And we've seen those heating events across Australia, in the Central Australia, for example. And that's what we've got to really look at. And the events that are really marked out in the IPCC reports that give us a clear view of what's going to happen and what is happening in Lismore is likely with El Niño again to occur at the end of the year. So, you know, those flooding events won't stop. And I think that we need to really understand remote communities and also rural communities across Australia are suffering because of inaction. So we really need to get together and be heard on this issue as an Australian and a public issue. We need to be heard.
Thanks, Virginia. Jamie?
This question of how to manage water with climate change is a debate we haven't had and need to have. I'm going to focus on the Murray-Darling Basin because that's where we're seeing the real impacts and the highest contestation over losses of water due to climate change. The authority in 2020 reported that over the previous 20 years, inflows had declined 39%. So many in government agencies say that's okay because our water entitlements are a share of the available resource. We don't need to worry because if it's a dry year, people just get less. The problem with that approach is that it doesn't allow for thresholds being crossed where things collapse, as we saw with the Darling drying up a few years ago and the fish kills and rural communities without decent drinking water. In the Wentworth group of concerned scientists, what we're proposing are 3 ways of dealing with that. One is that water entitlements are indexed to the climate And as water availability declines, so too does the face value of the water entitlements. Another is that states like New South Wales actually implement their own water management acts and their priorities of use, so that downstream flow targets are set, that when there is a water inflow event, low priority users like irrigators aren't allowed to pump until river flows reach the flow targets that are needed to support high priority uses like town water supplies, like key environmental assets. And the third thing we need to change is the way some of the rivers are operated. So, another of the many failings of the state of New South Wales is that while many rivers run on a debit system, whereby the only water let out of a dam is the water stored in the dam, 3 of the most important rivers run on a sort of credit card system, whereby the state government predicts river inflows and lets out water in advance to low priority users, which of course is disastrous in a drying climate if you're letting out water ahead of ensuring that you can meet the needs of essential users like towns. And so some simple changes to operating rules could be a step towards adapting to a drier climate.
Thanks, Jamie. Paul, did you have any quick comments?
No, that's fine. Not
okay, great. Well, we're heading into the, Mark, yep.
Oh, look, thanks, Karina. Just agree with Jamie's views about incorporating climate change into some of the operational rules and things. But I think there has to be some much more explicit acknowledgement of some of these issues we've talked about, including climate change and First Nations, in things like the terms of reference of the new commission and committees. And so that needs to be built in, so it can't be sidelined, like climate change was with the original plan, on the basis of it was too uncertain, and that uncertainty itself was a function of choice of methodology that was settled on. And so I think we need to, have this hard coded into the terms of reference, think about representation of these issues and other issues, including youth representation in the membership of these entities as well. So we actually start to build not just the voice, but also the capacity within those different groups. And I also think, coming back to the science and choice of methods, it's pretty clear these days that if you just choose, for example, the global climate models as the basis for assessing future water flows in our rivers, we're going to be underestimating significantly the likely impact of climate change. And similarly with agricultural production and other things. So if we look, say, for example, at the rate of change of the water cycle globally and regionally across the globe, it's actually changing at double the rate that the global climate models would predict. And that's been known for a long time. And so if we just simply, take the sausage handle and sausage grinder and turn the handle and get out a number straight from those models, we are knowingly going to be underestimating the risk for these systems. And if you're actually a professional, someone like Virginia, and you knowingly underestimate the risk and present that as a good estimate of risk to a client, you're actually potentially liable. And so this is the sort of thing we need to actually think about hard. It's not just about updating the science, it's about sitting back and saying, what is the appropriate science we need to bring to the table to get good outcomes and lead us to a vision, that mysterious vision that we're going for, that actually should underpin this policy.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Look, we're heading right up into the end of the hour. I was going to ask you all in just one sentence to give your advice to the incoming government. So given that we've got 4 minutes left, you're going to have to be brief. Hannah, I'm going to go to you first.
I mean, in our defense, you did say 1 minute and not one sentence.
Well, you all had really great answers to the questions and we went a bit longer than we were expecting. So
Yeah, no worries. Look, thanks so much for having me here today. Look, I'd really welcome anyone wanting to get in touch regarding some of the youth issues that we've touched on. Happy to carry on this conversation. My bit of advice is really not just thinking about the what or the how of water future, really centering the who. You know, when we're talking about future of work, future of technology, future of environment, we're really talking about future of society, and right now that's young people. And so these people coming of age into a world that looks exceptionally different to the world that today's decision makers grew up in, finding meaningful ways to really engage youth voices is going to be critical. And that might be, you know, Mark mentioned representation on committees and so on. That'll be essential. Also establishing a youth voice to water for policy in more structured ways will also be really essential going forward. So my advice is working with them, not about them. And that's going to be really crucial for a better world that they can inherit.
Great. Thanks, Hannah. Paul?
Thanks, Karina. The first suggestion or recommendation would be a national drinking water quality database administered by the National Water Commission that collates all public reporting, or all reporting rather, of drinking water quality and other related variables across Australia. In order to help set that up, some community-led baseline surveys across Australia, so we really know what situation we're in now before we even take into account climate change. In terms of National Water Initiative reform, public reporting of drinking water monitoring being mandatory and standardised to enable said database in all jurisdictions, including New South Wales, where it's not required by regulation. And then also in terms of NWI reform, we haven't talked too much about those large water infrastructure projects, which are still there, and they require some public scrutiny as to whether they stack up in terms of the requirements for government funding. In future, I would recommend, in terms of National Water Initiative reform, that in the NWI, any large government infrastructure project over $100 million, or it's $250 now with the Infrastructure Australia reviews, that there is required that there is a publicly available business case that is available for scrutiny before an investment decision is made. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Mark?
Thanks, Karina. Look, I'd say it's a good start, but we've got no time to waste. And as a result, we need to go harder. We need to go faster. We need to go more inclusive. We need to go evidence-based. And we need to go integrative, which means bringing water and energy and food and regional development and equity and other factors in there. And we need to build capacity.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Virginia?
Yes, just picking up from Mark, building capacity for Indigenous communities is so essential. Citizen science in Indigenous communities, and building up research and development funding for Indigenous-led research into all of these areas: food security, climate justice, water security. I mean, a whole range of these issues cannot be siloed anymore. And I think that's really what we're saying. You know, there was a Department of Agriculture, Department of Environment, Department of Water. From an Indigenous perspective, it's all one and the same thing. And also, when you commit money to Indigenous communities, pay up. I mean, that's really important. And this is the message with Mildred and NBARN. Don't just commit it on paper, transfer the funds. I mean, this is one of the most important issues to really make sure that when governments say that they're going to do something, that they commit to it and they do the action. One thing, again, we talked about with the National Water Commission, I think many of us are not convinced in the community that this is a good model as is. It must have Indigenous commissioners that are gendered representatives. And also we need to have Indigenous science front and centre. It's really important, the work that Wentworth scientist groups have done over the years, and the work of many other colleagues at ANU and other institutions. But if you don't have the core of this through Indigenous science and Indigenous knowledge, we're going to lose a lot of opportunities to really work together and really make solutions happen. But a willing government is really important for us to get together and inform government and really, as Mark said, evidence-based, and that's what we're all about. And also, I think our legal professionals need to get on board and really strongly advocate on all of these areas, because we have a lot of terrific, good-hearted, passionate lawyers across Australia and the world. And you really can't support all of these issues without us as well. So we need to be there.
Great. Thank you, Virginia. And Jamie, final word, noting that we're over time.
With one exception, the incoming government's water policies are a great improvement and a really big agenda for a first term of government. So I say focus on those, implement them well, axe the $8 billion committed to dodgy dam proposals, and you'll have plenty of money to do the job. March on the recalcitrant states, take on Macquarie Street and sort out those state governments.
Winner, thanks, Jamie. Thank you so much to our panellists. I hope everybody has enjoyed the panel as much as I have. I've learned a lot. You keep the conversation going on Twitter, and if you're interested to learn more about what we do at Institute for Water Futures, then look us up on Google and subscribe to our newsletter. All right. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Mana Gore.